The year was 1854, and the American South stood on the edge of chaos. The plantations stretched endlessly across fertile land, their profits built on the backs of enslaved men and women whose lives were dictated by the whims of masters. Cotton was king, tobacco was still profitable, and slavery had become the bedrock of a society that called itself honorable, yet thrived on cruelty. In this world of rigid hierarchies, social standing was everything. A man's worth was not only measured in wealth, but in how fiercely he defended tradition, pride, and the invisible lines that separated white from black, free from enslaved, master from servant. Among these plantations, in the heart of the Deep South, lived a man whose arrogance made him both admired and despised by his peers. He was a wealthy plantation owner, a man who measured his power not only in acres of land or the number of slaves he commanded, but in how far he could push society's limits and still come out on top. He was known for his gambling, his drinking, and above all, his cruel sense of humor. For him, life was a stage, and every reckless act was an opportunity to remind others that his word was law. On his plantation worked dozens of enslaved men and women, forced to toil under the sun, their existence reduced to labor, their humanity ignored. Among them was a woman who stood out, not because of her status, for she was enslaved like the others, but because of her presence. She was the plantation's cook, a heavy-set woman whose sighs drew cruel laughter from the owner's friends, yet whose skill in the kitchen earned her quiet respect among the enslaved. Her hands knew the secrets of Southern cooking, transforming meager ingredients into hearty meals. To the enslaved community, she was a figure of quiet strength, someone who endured mockery yet never bowed her head. It was during one drunken evening that her life, and the life of the entire plantation, would change forever. The owner, surrounded by fellow planters and wealthy guests, sought to outdo them in a contest of pride. Fueled by arrogance and liquor, he boasted that he could do what none of them would ever dare. He would marry his fat cook slave, and in doing so, prove that he was beyond shame, beyond rules, and beyond the reach of anyone's judgment. The room erupted in laughter and disbelief. Marriage between a white master and an enslaved black woman was not only taboo, it was unthinkable. Such a union would scandalize the entire South, shatter the codes of race and class that held society together, and invite ridicule upon his name. But for this man, that was the point. His pride demanded that he shock, that he humiliate, that he prove no one's opinion had power over him. The bet was made, and the stage was set for a decision that would ripple far beyond the plantation walls. When word spread that he had followed through, marrying the cook-slave in a crude ceremony, the South recoiled. Neighbors whispered in outrage. Letters carried rumors from county to county, each one more scandalized than the last. For the elite of the South, planters, merchants, ministers, this was not only shameful, it was dangerous. If a man of status could cross such a line, what did that mean for the very system they lived and died to protect? For the enslaved, the reaction was different. Some feared it meant harsher treatment, for humiliation often led to cruelty. Others wondered if it could shift the balance of power, if this strange, unwanted marriage might give the cook a kind of protection none of them had ever known. But all of them knew one truth: when a master acted on a whim, it was the enslaved who suffered the consequences. This was not a love story. It was not an act of kindness, nor a rebellion against the system of slavery. It was a bet, a cruel, prideful wager that mocked both the woman forced into it and the society that would never forgive it. The South prided itself on its codes of honor, its traditions of purity, its carefully constructed social barriers. But in one drunken night, one reckless marriage, those codes were dragged into the mud. The scandal of 1854 would become one of the most whispered tales of the antebellum South, not because it was extraordinary love, but because it was extraordinary arrogance. What began as a bet ended as a disgrace, a story that revealed the dark hypocrisy of a world built on cruelty and pride. And though the names would fade, the story itself lingered, a reminder of how fragile the illusions of honor truly were in a society built on the suffering of others. The story begins not with a wedding, but with the daily rhythms of life on a Southern plantation in 1854. To understand the shock that this marriage created, one must first understand the world in which it occurred, a world rigidly divided by race, class, and the institution of slavery. Plantations in the mid-19th century were kingdoms unto themselves. The owner was king, his wealth measured in both land and the number of enslaved people he commanded. Cotton and tobacco flowed out of these estates, feeding an economy built entirely on human bondage. Beneath the grandeur of sprawling fields and stately homes lay the suffering of hundreds of enslaved men, women, and children, whose lives were controlled by every whim of the master. Their labor was relentless, their humanity dismissed, their bodies considered property. It was into this world that the plantation owner of our story thrived. He was not only wealthy but prideful, a man who enjoyed demonstrating his superiority at every turn. His reputation stretched far beyond his own land. Other planters knew him as someone bold, reckless, and cruelly entertaining. At social gatherings, he was often at the center, boasting loudly, drinking heavily, and daring others to match his bravado. The enslaved, however, saw a different side of him. They saw not charm but cruelty. His punishments were swift, often harsh, and designed to remind them of their place. Yet, despite his iron grip, life found its rhythms. The fields echoed with the sounds of labor from dawn until dusk, the overseer's whip cracking in the background. At the big house, enslaved servants hurried about their tasks, from cleaning to serving meals. And in the kitchen, commanding her small domain, stood the woman who would become central to this scandal, the cook. She was not beautiful by the cruel standards of Southern high society. She was heavy-set, her body often mocked by the planter's guests, and even by the master himself when the liquor flowed too freely. But to the enslaved, she was something else entirely, a pillar. Her cooking kept them alive when rations were scarce. Her strength, physical and spiritual, inspired those who worked beside her. She had endured years of bondage without breaking, her resilience a quiet rebellion against a system designed to crush her spirit. Her kitchen was more than a workplace. It was a gathering place. The enslaved whispered there, sharing news, prayers, and the faintest sparks of hope. Children clung to her skirts, drawn to her warmth. She carried herself with dignity, even when mocked, even when degraded. Perhaps it was that unshakable dignity that caught the master's eye, not in admiration, but as a target for one of his cruelest jokes. The fateful evening began as so many others did, with drink. The owner had invited several fellow planters to his home. They gathered in the parlor, surrounded by the trappings of wealth, polished wood, expensive glassware, and the faint smell of tobacco. Cards were played, wagers made, and liquor poured freely. As the night deepened, their conversations grew bolder, their laughter louder. In such circles, pride was currency, and to back down from a dare was to lose face. It was in this haze of alcohol and bravado that the bet was born. The cook, perhaps delivering food or clearing dishes, passed through the room. Her presence became the subject of mockery. The planters jeered, making crude remarks about her size, her appearance, her role in the household. The master, unwilling to let himself be the butt of laughter, turned the insult into a challenge. "I'll do what none of you dare," he declared, slamming his glass down. "I'll marry her. I'll take my fat cook as my wife, and I'll still stand taller than every one of you." The room roared with disbelief. At first, they thought he was joking, but his eyes carried that dangerous gleam they knew too well. For him, humiliation was a weapon. He would rather destroy himself than allow another man to laugh at him. And so the wager was set. His peers, thinking it impossible, goaded him on. The idea of a wealthy white planter marrying a black slave was beyond scandal. It was social suicide. No man of his rank could do such a thing and still be respected. But that was exactly why he intended to do it. For the cook, the moment was terrifying. She had no voice in the matter. In the twisted logic of slavery, her life and body were not her own. Consent was irrelevant. To her, the marriage was not a union but another form of bondage, one wrapped in the guise of ceremony. She must have felt the eyes of everyone upon her, knowing the ridicule, the danger, the uncertainty that would follow. Yet she had no choice. Within days, the bet was fulfilled. A crude ceremony was arranged, performed not out of love or even legality, but out of spite. The master stood proudly, daring the world to laugh at him, while the cook stood silent, bound by chains invisible yet unbreakable. For those who witnessed it, the moment was surreal, a collision of pride, cruelty, and a society's deepest fears. News spread quickly. Plantation society was small, its gossip channels swift. Neighbors recoiled in horror. Whispers filled church pews, county gatherings, and market stalls. The scandal grew with each retelling, the details exaggerated, but the truth undeniable: a white planter had married his slave cook. To some, it was proof of his madness. To others, it was a calculated act of arrogance. For all, it was a line that should never have been crossed. And yet, beneath the outrage, the scandal revealed a darker truth. The South prided itself on its codes of honor, its rigid hierarchies, its carefully maintained illusions of purity. But those illusions had always been fragile. Relationships between masters and enslaved women were not rare. They were common, though almost always hidden, denied, or dismissed. What made this case different was not the act itself, but the fact that it was brought into the light. By calling it marriage, the planter had exposed the hypocrisy of a society that pretended such things did not exist. For the enslaved, the fallout was immediate. Fear grew in the quarters. Some hoped the cook's new position might shield them from the master's wrath, but many suspected the opposite, that his humiliation would make him crueler than ever. They were right to worry. A man who would gamble with a woman's life for pride was capable of anything. Thus began the strange, twisted tale of a bet that became a scandal, a marriage that shocked the South, and a story that revealed the deep cracks in a society already heading toward its own collapse. The marriage was not an act of love, nor even of lust. It was an act of power, pride, and recklessness, and its consequences would ripple far beyond the plantation walls. The morning after the scandalous wedding, the plantation grounds felt eerily quiet, as though the land itself was holding its breath. Yet silence could not contain what had happened. By the time the sun rose high, word of the planter's reckless vow had already begun its journey across county lines. News traveled faster than one might imagine in 1854. A single whisper could ride on horseback, be exchanged in markets, and be gossiped about in church pews. By week's end, nearly every plantation owner within miles knew the tale. A wealthy white master had married his fat black cook, and in doing so, had set fire to the very social order of the South. At first, many dismissed it as drunken gossip. Surely, no man of such standing would degrade himself to that extent. Plantations were kingdoms of order and appearances. Every detail of life, from the dress of a planter's wife to the design of a parlor room, was crafted to reflect wealth and superiority. The notion that one of their peers had shattered that carefully arranged faade was too outrageous to be real. But as the accounts piled up, some from the very men who had witnessed the event, the truth could no longer be denied. The community's outrage was swift and vicious. Among the Southern elite, the concept of honor was everything. Honor determined a man's worth, his power, and his family's place in society. To marry a black woman, a slave no less, was not simply a breach of etiquette. It was considered an unforgivable crime against the codes of whiteness and superiority that held their world together. Whispers turned into open condemnation. At church, ministers thundered from pulpits, disguising their outrage as moral sermonizing. They preached about sin, about the corruption of God's natural order, and about the danger of letting wickedness seep into the fabric of their communities. But beneath the religious language lay a deeper, unspoken fear. If one wealthy white planter could openly marry a black slave, then what stopped others from doing the same? And if such unions were acknowledged, would not the lie of Southern racial purity collapse before their very eyes? The scandal spread beyond the county, reaching towns and even newspapers. Local editors, careful not to name names directly, penned scathing articles about the decay of Southern manhood. Their words dripped with disgust, calling the act a humiliation not only to the man himself but to the entire South. Better to be ruined in fortune than in honor. One editorial wrote, "For honor once lost, no wealth can restore." The implication was clear. This marriage was not merely a private affair but a collective disgrace. Neighbors began to distance themselves. Invitations to social gatherings no longer arrived. Business dealings became strained. Where once the planter had been admired for his boldness and wealth, he was now seen as a dangerous stain, a reminder of the thin line between respectability and ruin. Some whispered that he had gone mad, others that drink had finally rotted his mind. A few, more cynical, claimed he had done it to spite them all, to prove that their outrage could not touch him. Inside the plantation, however, the consequences were far more immediate and personal. The enslaved community reacted with a mixture of shock, fear, and uneasy hope. For many, the marriage was terrifying. They knew the master's pride could curdle into cruelty. Already he had used their lives as tools in his games of power. Would this bet not make things worse? The cook herself, now thrust into a bizarre position, walked a dangerous line. Though she had been married, in the eyes of the planter, In the eyes of the law and society, she was still property. She bore the heavy weight of her new role, knowing every glance from the other slaves carried questions she could not answer. And yet, some dared to wonder if her new position might offer protection. If the master truly considered her his wife, even if only to uphold his wager, would he shield her from the whips and punishments so common in the quarters? Could she use her influence to lessen the suffering of others? These thoughts sparked quiet conversations late at night, whispered between families huddled in their cabins. Hope, however faint, flickered in the darkness, but hope was dangerous, and the planter, in his arrogance, gave little sign of changing his ways. Instead, he flaunted his scandal as though it were a badge of honor. He invited guests to his home, daring them to acknowledge his wife, to look her in the eye, to speak her name. Few did. Most refused to set foot on his land, while those who came could hardly conceal their disgust. His provocations only deepened the anger of his peers. The scandal also unsettled the women of the planter class. Southern white women, already trapped within the strict codes of obedience and domesticity, saw in this marriage a grotesque insult to their own positions. Many of them knew, though it was rarely spoken aloud, that their husbands often preyed upon enslaved women. It was a bitter truth they swallowed in silence. But those affairs were hidden, denied, shrouded in secrecy. To make such a union public was to rub salt in their wounds, to turn their private humiliation into a public outrage. Their whispers fueled the scandal further, spreading it with venom born of both fear and resentment. As months passed, the story became more than gossip. It became a symbol. For the elite, it was proof of moral decay, of the dangers of pride unrestrained. For ministers, it was a rallying cry, a way to warn congregations of the evils that threatened their way of life. For ordinary Southerners, it became a tale told with both horror and fascination, whispered around firesides and over store counters. And for the enslaved, it was a reminder of both the cruelty and unpredictability of those who owned them. In this way, the marriage became larger than the individuals involved. It exposed the contradictions at the heart of Southern society. The planter's peers condemned him not for exploiting a black woman, that was common practice, but for daring to acknowledge her in a way that blurred the lines of race and status. Their outrage revealed the fragile foundations of their world, a world built on lies they desperately needed to believe. The cook, caught at the center, carried the heaviest burden. She endured the whispers, the mockery, the glares. She cooked the meals, tended the fires, and walked the halls of a house that now buzzed with scandal. Each day, she bore herself with dignity, her silence louder than the ridicule around her. For though she had no choice in her fate, she remained unbroken, a woman whose very existence was now a threat to the lies of the South. Thus, Chapter 2 closes not with resolution but with escalation. The scandal was no longer confined to one plantation. It had spread like wildfire, consuming conversations, reputations, and the fragile illusions of honor that the South held so dear. What began as a drunken bet had become a symbol of rebellion against the very structure of Southern life. And though the planter reveled in the chaos he had unleashed, the storm he had stirred was far from over. Life within the plantation house had always followed a strict rhythm, dictated by the master's moods and the endless duties of the enslaved who kept it running. But after the scandalous marriage, that rhythm was broken. The air itself seemed charged with unease, as though every creak of the wooden floorboards carried whispers, every candle's flicker cast suspicious shadows. The master's reckless act had not only shaken the community beyond the plantation, it had fractured the delicate balance inside his own home. The cook, now his so-called wife, carried on with her work as though nothing had changed. Each morning she rose before dawn, tending the fires, preparing the day's bread, and stirring pots that would feed both the master's table and the quarters. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency, yet her eyes betrayed the weight she carried. To the other enslaved workers, she was no longer simply the cook. They looked at her with a mixture of awe, confusion, and fear. Some thought she had gained power. Others believed she had been cursed. The enslaved knew all too well that proximity to the master was dangerous. To be noticed was often to be punished or used, or broken. And yet here she was, thrust into his spotlight, made into a symbol of his arrogance. The women of the quarters whispered among themselves. Would she receive favors now? Would her children, if she bore any, be spared the lash? Or would his cruelty fall harder on her than on anyone else? precisely because he had turned her into the subject of mockery across the South. For the master, the marriage became a game to flaunt. He delighted in parading her presence, though he never gave her dignity. When guests visited, few as they were now, he would order her into the parlor, not to sit beside him but to stand silently, tray in hand, as though the sight of her in both roles, wife and servant, amused him. His laughter filled the room as others squirmed, avoiding her eyes. He reveled in their discomfort, feeding on the outrage of his peers as though it were fine wine. But within the walls of the house, the reality was more bitter. The enslaved servants who tended to the household moved cautiously, uncertain of how to address her. Was she still the cook? Was she now mistress? The very word seemed absurd on their tongues, yet the fear of misstep was real. Some tried to show her respect in small ways, softening their voices, bowing their heads slightly. Others kept their distance, afraid that any closeness to her would draw unwanted attention. The master's arrogance grew with each day, but so too did his isolation. His peers had stopped calling. His name was whispered in contempt. Invitations ceased. Where once his grand home had been a stage for social gatherings, it now stood silent, its halls echoing with emptiness. Even the enslaved noticed the shift. Fewer visitors meant fewer distractions, fewer chances to sneak away or barter for scraps of freedom. The household became a kind of prison, not just for the enslaved but for the master himself, locked within the scandal he had created. The cook bore the brunt of this strange new reality. At meals, she served him alone, his laughter ringing hollow as he poured himself another glass of whiskey. At night, she returned to her corner of the house, neither fully enslaved nor truly free, caught in a cruel in-between space. Her dignity remained intact. She did not bow her head in shame, nor did she beg for kindness. Yet the strain showed in the set of her jaw, the heaviness of her steps. For the enslaved community, the months that followed were filled with confusion. Some quietly hoped she might use her position to shield them from punishment. Perhaps she could soften his temper, redirect his wrath. Others feared the opposite, that she would become a reminder of his pride, a living trophy he used to prove his dominance, and that her presence would bring harsher punishments down on them all. The master, meanwhile, seemed drunk on his own rebellion. He thrived on scandal, writing letters to acquaintances in which he mocked their outrage, boasting that he had broken every rule of their society and still stood unbowed. But in truth, cracks were beginning to show. His finances, once strong, began to falter as old business partners cut ties. His drinking worsened, his temper grew shorter, and the lash fell heavier on those who could not meet his demands. The cook watched all of this unfold in silence. She never argued, never raised her voice, yet her presence became a quiet act of defiance. Simply by existing as his wife, she had unmasked the hypocrisy of the South, revealing what all enslaved women already knew, that the men who claimed purity and honor had long exploited them in secret. The only difference was that this master had done it openly, stripping away the lies his peers clung to. But silence could not hold forever. Rumors swirled among the enslaved that some of the neighboring planters were plotting against him. Whispers of threats reached the quarters, that if he continued flaunting this marriage, someone would take matters into their own hands. The idea of a duel was spoken of, though none dared approach him directly. Pride was a dangerous fire, and in the South, men killed to protect it. The house grew more tense with each passing week. Every knock at the door carried the weight of potential violence. Every letter delivered was opened with suspicion. And through it all, the cook endured, her very existence now both a shield and a target. She had not chosen this marriage, but she bore it as she bore all things, with strength that did not bend, though the world seemed determined to break her. By the close of the year, the plantation was a shadow of what it had once been. The master had won his bet, but at what cost? His reputation lay in ruins, his wealth was slipping, and his peers wanted nothing to do with him. Inside his home, his enslaved workers moved like ghosts, careful not to draw attention. And at the center of it all was the cook, once mocked, now feared, and always enduring. Her life had been bound by chains long before this so-called marriage. Yet now, in a strange and twisted way, she had become a chain around the master himself, binding him to the scandal he could not escape. The house was divided not only by race and status, but by pride and fear, dignity and shame. And though no one could yet see how the story would end, everyone knew one thing: the storm that had begun with a drunken bet was far from over. By the spring of 1855, the scandal had swollen beyond whispers and private outrage. What had begun as a drunken bet and a mockery of Southern honor now stood as a public defiance that the planter wore like a crown. The marriage to his cook had ceased to be only a personal affair. It had become a symbol, one that threatened the carefully guarded illusions of the South. And for a society obsessed with appearances, symbols were everything. Plantation owners across the county no longer tried to hide their contempt. Where once they had shaken their heads in private, now they spoke openly of their disgust. Letters passed between estates carried sharp condemnations, describing him as a man unfit for polite company, a disgrace to the planter class. In town meetings, his name was spat out like poison. He had not simply broken a social rule. He had mocked the very foundation of their world. Yet the master reveled in their hatred. He carried himself with even greater pride, his back straight, his chin high, his laughter booming in the taverns when he dared to show his face. Let them whisper, he told his dwindling circle of drinking companions. Let them choke on their honor. I have done what no man has dared, and still I stand. His words were met with uneasy chuckles, for even those who lingered near him knew the danger of being associated with his scandal. The hostility of his peers began to take on sharper edges. Merchants who once offered him credit now refused. Local churches declared him unwelcome, not only barring him but warning others against association. There were rumors of secret meetings among planters, whispers of action to be taken if he continued flaunting his marriage. The South was not kind to those who shattered its codes. And though they cloaked their outrage in talk of morality, it was fear that fueled them. Fear that his rebellion might inspire others to question the system that bound them all together. For the enslaved community, this gathering storm was felt in the tightening grip of daily life. The master's temper, already short, grew more violent as the pressures mounted. Whippings became more frequent, punishments more cruel. He seemed determined to prove that while he might scandalize his peers, his control over his slaves remained absolute. The cook, caught in the center, endured these dark days with stoic silence. Though she now carried the title of wife, in the twisted theater of the master's pride, she remained a slave in every sense. Her body bound by law, her choices stolen, her dignity mocked. Yet whispers began to spread not only among the enslaved but among poor whites and free blacks in nearby towns. Some viewed the marriage with disgust, echoing the sentiments of the planter class. But others, quietly, saw it as a strange kind of rebellion. Here was proof that the mighty were not untouchable, that the system could be mocked, even if by a cruel and drunken man. For every voice that cursed his name, there were others who told the tale with a mix of horror and fascination. By midsummer, the hostility reached a boiling point. One evening, as the master rode into town, he was confronted outside the tavern by a group of neighboring planters. Their words were sharp, their eyes full of contempt. "You've dragged us all into shame?" One of them spat. "Your disgrace stains the whole South." The master laughed, throwing back his head. "My shame," he roared. "No, gentlemen. It is your shame that you keep hidden in the dark. Do you think I don't know of your slaves, of the children who bear your eyes but not your names? You are cowards, all of you hiding behind lies. I have simply done what you all do in secret, and I dared to call her wife." The confrontation nearly came to blows. Pistols were hinted at, hands resting on holsters, but no shots were fired that night. Still, the message was clear: his peers were no longer content with whispers and ostracism. His arrogance had turned the community into enemies, and enemies in the South had a way of settling matters with blood. Back at the plantation, the tension thickened. The cook went about her work quietly, but she too felt the weight of the storm. Each night, the sound of horses on the distant road made hearts quicken in fear. Was it angry neighbors come to drag the master into a duel? Or worse, to bring violence upon them all? The enslaved whispered of escape, of running north, though the risks were deadly. Some believed the master's downfall was inevitable, and when it came, those bound to his land would be the first to suffer. The cook herself bore a quiet dignity that unsettled even the master. She did not curse, nor did she plead. She carried herself as though she knew a truth that he could not touch. At times, when his temper flared and his pride drove him to mock her, she met his gaze with a silence that cut deeper than words. In those moments, though he would never admit it, he felt the weight of something he could not control. By autumn, the scandal had reached newspapers far beyond the county. Editors in distant cities used the story as ammunition against the South, mocking the hypocrisy of a society that condemned one man for acknowledging publicly what so many practiced in secret. Abolitionist papers in the North seized upon the tale, twisting it into proof of slavery's corruption, its ability to rot honor and humanity alike. For the master's peers, this was the final insult. Not only had he disgraced them among themselves, he had armed their enemies. The pressure to act grew unbearable. Some spoke of arranging his quiet removal, a mysterious accident, a fire, a duel that would never be reported honestly. His name had become too heavy a burden, his scandal too dangerous to ignore. And yet he continued to flaunt it, parading his cook through the halls of his home, forcing visitors to face her presence, laughing in the face of their disgust. The storm gathered not just around him, but within the walls of his own house. His enslaved workers watched, their fear mingling with a strange anticipation. For they knew that arrogance, when stretched too far, eventually breaks. The master had mocked not only his society but the very foundations of the world they lived in. And in the South of 1855, no one, no matter how rich, no matter how proud, could mock that world without paying a price. The stage was set. The whispers had turned to threats, the threats into plans. The planter believed himself untouchable, yet every man in the county knew that his downfall was only a matter of time. And as the leaves turned red and gold, and the nights grew long and cold, the plantation stood at the heart of a storm that would soon consume them all. By the winter of 1855, the plantation no longer resembled the thriving estate it had once been. The fields still stretched wide, the cabins of the enslaved still smoked with morning fires, and the grand house still loomed in white against the horizon. But beneath the surface, everything had shifted. The scandal that had begun as a drunken bet had spread like wildfire, and now it threatened to consume not only the master but everyone tied to his land. The master, however, refused to see it. He still strutted through his halls with the same swagger, still poured whiskey into his glass with the same boastful grin, still called his cook wife, with a mockery that blurred the line between arrogance and madness. Yet the cracks were showing, even if he denied them. His accounts had begun to dry up. Merchants refused him credit. Fellow planters no longer welcomed him at their tables. The few allies who lingered did so out of fear rather than loyalty, unwilling to stand openly beside a man so thoroughly condemned. Inside his home, the silence grew heavier. His enslaved workers moved like shadows, careful with every step, fearful of his temper. The cook herself endured it all with a stoic dignity that unsettled him more than he admitted. She neither embraced nor rejected the role he had forced upon her. She simply lived, her silence louder than his boasts. At times, when he mocked her in front of guests, she would meet his gaze without flinching, her eyes steady, her face unbowed. In those moments, it was as if his pride faltered, for she revealed a truth he could not escape. He had bound himself not to a bet, but to a living, breathing reminder of his own corruption. Beyond the plantation, the anger of his peers was turning dangerous. Local newspapers had fanned the flames, and abolitionist presses in the North gleefully published his story as proof of the South's hypocrisy. To them, his scandal showed that slavery corrupted all it touched, not only the enslaved but the masters themselves. For the planter class, already paranoid about their image, this was intolerable. To allow him to go unpunished was to admit their world could be mocked, their codes of honor defied. Rumors began to swirl of a plan. Some spoke of arranging an accident, a hunting mishap, a fall from a horse, perhaps a fire that would consume the house and bury the shame with it. Others whispered of duels, though none dared challenge him openly for fear of the spectacle it would create. The whispers grew louder with each passing week, until even the enslaved caught fragments of them through doors and windows, carried back to the quarters where they were repeated in hushed tones by firelight. The enslaved community felt the storm closing in. They knew too well that when the master's pride was threatened, it was they who paid the price. The lash fell harder. The punishments grew more cruel. The cook, though shielded in some ways by her unwanted title, bore the weight of his moods most heavily. At times he forced her to stand at his side, as though daring others to deny her place. At others, he pushed her back into the shadows, barking commands that reminded her, and everyone else, that she was still a slave. Yet the enslaved also saw something shift. The master's arrogance, once unshakable, had begun to look like desperation. His laughter rang hollow, his boasts repeated too often, as though he were trying to convince himself of his strength. The cook, silent and unbroken, became a kind of quiet center in the chaos. She never sought power, yet her very presence unsettled him. She was the chain he had forged around himself, a living proof of the scandal he had unleashed. One night, as winter winds howled through the trees, a rider arrived at the plantation. He brought no greeting, no warmth. He asked only to speak with the master, his voice low, his tone sharp. The meeting lasted hours, muffled voices rising in anger and then dropping into tense silence. When at last the rider left, the master emerged with whiskey on his breath and fury in his eyes. He smashed a glass against the hearth, shouting curses into the empty air. The enslaved who watched from the shadows understood the threats were no longer whispers. They had come to his doorstep. The following weeks were marked by paranoia. The master carried pistols on his belt, even within his own halls. He ordered the enslaved to watch the roads, to report any stranger who lingered too long. He drank more heavily than ever, his temper snapping like dry twigs. At times he would laugh, boasting that no one dared touch him. At others, he raged at invisible enemies, pacing the halls like a caged animal. The cook endured it all. She continued her work, tending the fires, preparing meals, her face calm though her heart carried the weight of uncertainty. To the other enslaved, she became a symbol of endurance. They whispered about her at night, wondering how she bore the burden, how she could stand so strong in the face of so much hatred. Some even began to believe she carried a kind of protection, that the very scandal which endangered them all gave her a strange power. By spring, the master's downfall seemed inevitable. His finances crumbled further. His peers shunned him completely. His name was spoken only in mockery or disgust. And yet, he clung to his pride, insisting that he had won, that by marrying his cook, he had proven himself untouchable. But the walls of his world were closing in. For in the South of 1855, pride was not eternal. Pride was fragile, and when broken, it shattered with violence. The master had mocked his society, exposed its hypocrisy, and dared to flaunt the very lines others lived and died to protect. The storm he had stirred was nearly upon him, and deep within the house, the cook knew, as did all who lived under his roof, that pride had a price. And soon, the master would be forced to pay it. The year 1856 dawned heavy with unease. Winter had stripped the land bare, and the plantation stood like a ghost of its former glory. Fields half-tended, livestock thin, the air filled with the brittle silence of fear. The master still clung to his pride, but the weight of his reputation was crushing him. He was a man surrounded by shadows, and everyone in his world, enslaved and free alike, knew the storm was nearly here. In town, the whispers of his downfall had turned into open talk. At the taverns, men muttered over Al about the disgrace he had brought upon their class. "He's mocked us all," one said, slamming his cup down. "If we don't deal with him, the Yankees will make us a laughingstock." Others nodded grimly, for the newspapers from the North had already spun his story into sensational headlines. "Southern gentleman marries his slave as a bet." Each article ridiculed not just him but the entire planter aristocracy, for men whose pride was rooted in honor. Such mockery was intolerable. Behind closed doors, meetings were held. They spoke of punishment, of restoring order. Some demanded his estate be stripped from him. Others argued for something more final. But none denied that he had to be silenced. Each day the talk grew bolder, and each day his isolation deepened. Back on the plantation, the enslaved felt the tension like a noose around their necks. The master's rage had grown unpredictable. He prowled the halls with a pistol always near at hand, his boots striking the wooden floors like thunder. His eyes carried a wildness that unnerved even those who had once feared him most. At night, shouts echoed from the great house, curses thrown into the darkness as if he were fighting enemies no one else could see. The cook, his so-called wife, remained a steady presence. She bore his temper with a quiet strength that unsettled him more than resistance ever could. Her silence was like a mirror, reflecting his corruption back at him. Though he forced her into the role, she never bowed to it. When he mocked her, she stood unflinching. When he tried to parade her as a symbol of his defiance, she endured without a word. To those who watched, she became more than a victim. She became the embodiment of his ruin, the reminder of the bet that had destroyed him. Among the enslaved, hope began to take root in whispers. They spoke cautiously, always by the fires at night or in the fields when no overseer lingered nearby. "His time's ending," one man said, voice hushed. "They'll take him soon." Another nodded, glancing over his shoulder. "And when he falls, maybe the chains will break with him." Though they dared not plan openly, the knowledge that their master's power was weakening gave them courage they had not felt before. One evening, a group of riders appeared at the gates. They were not strangers. Their faces were those of neighboring planters, men who had once drunk with the master, once shared cigars on grand porches. But this night their visit carried no warmth. They entered the house, their voices rising in tense argument that spilled into the halls. The enslaved crept closer to listen, hearts pounding. "You've disgraced us all!" one of the men shouted. "I owe you nothing," the master bellowed back, his words slurred with drink. "You've made us a joke to the north, to the world," another voice thundered. "I'll burn this whole place to the ground before I bend to you," the master roared. The argument ended with the slam of a door and the thunder of hooves as the riders departed, their anger carried into the night. But the enslaved who had listened knew what it meant. The noose around their master's neck was tightening. The cook, though outwardly calm, understood as well. She had seen enough of men's pride to know it would end in violence. At night, when the master slumped in his chair, drunk and muttering, she stared at the flames in the hearth and wondered how much longer the walls would hold. In the quarters, the enslaved began preparing in quiet ways. A hidden stash of dried cornmeal, a sharpened tool buried beneath a floorboard, whispered directions to a creek that led north. Some believed escape might soon be possible in the chaos. Others feared blood would soak the fields before freedom came. But all knew the plantation stood on the edge of something irreversible. One night, as the master staggered through the halls, pistol in hand, he caught sight of a shadow moving in the dark. He fired, the shot echoing like thunder. The enslaved froze, hearts racing. But when the smoke cleared, the only victim was a shattered mirror, glass glittering across the floor. The master stood trembling, sweat pouring down his face, whispering curses at ghosts only he could see. To the enslaved, it was a sign. He was unraveling. The man who had once commanded with cruelty now stumbled like a beast wounded by its own pride. His downfall was no longer a matter of if, but when. A spring crept in with heavy rains that turned the fields into mud. The plantation's debts mounted. Merchants refused to sell to him, and overseers quit rather than work under his madness. Still, he clung to his pride, boasting that no man dared touch him. But even he must have felt the truth gnawing at him in the silence of the night his world was collapsing. And all the while, the cook remained silent, steady, unbroken. She did not raise her voice, did not strike back, but her very presence was his undoing. He had thought marrying her would prove his dominance, would make him untouchable. Instead, it became the chain that dragged him into ruin. By the end of spring, the plantation no longer felt alive. It was a stage set for a reckoning. The fields lay half-fallowed, the house heavy with tension, the enslaved watching every road for the arrival of riders. And deep within the master's halls, his footsteps echoed like a drumbeat of doom. The storm had gathered. The air was thick with it. And soon thunder would fall. The summer of 1856 pressed down heavy on the Virginia soil, heat thick as tar, air buzzing with insects and tension. On the plantation, the fields lay untended, weeds swallowing rows that had once yielded profit. The grand house stood tall but hollow, its paint peeling, windows clouded with dust. To outsiders, it looked like a dying kingdom, a place where pride had festered into ruin. To those who lived within its walls, it felt like a powder keg waiting for a spark. The master had grown reckless. He carried pistols on both hips and slept with a shotgun leaning by his bed, his voice, once booming with arrogance, now cracked with paranoia. He accused his enslaved workers of plotting against him, beat men for imagined slights, and prowled the halls at night muttering threats. Yet he still clung to his marriage, mocking, flaunting, parading his cook, turned wife as though she were proof of his defiance. But everyone saw the truth. She was no proof of strength. She was his undoing. The neighboring planters had made their decision. The master's disgrace had poisoned not only his own name, but theirs as well. Northern newspapers mocked them with cartoons of Southern gentlemen bowing to enslaved wives. Abolitionist lecturers carried the tale across towns, painting it as evidence of the South's hypocrisy. To protect their world, they believed one man had to be sacrificed. It began with riders at dusk. 5 men came, their horses sweating, their faces grim beneath wide-brimmed hats. They were not strangers' neighbors, drinking partners from years past, men who had once clapped the master on the back at dances and praised his harvests. But tonight they carried rifles and cold intent. The enslaved saw them first. From the cabins, they watched the riders approach, dust rising behind their hooves. Some ducked inside, pulling children close. Others lingered, whispering prayers or curses. They knew what was coming. Whatever vengeance the neighbors had brought would not fall on the master alone. It would ripple through every life on the plantation. Inside the big house, the cook stood by the hearth when the door burst open. The master staggered in from the porch, pistol drawn, face red with fury. "They think they can take me!" he shouted. "They think they can shame me further." "I'll show them, Hubos." The cook said nothing. She watched him, her silence a weight heavier than words. In her eyes, he saw the truth he feared most, that the reckoning was here and no pistol could save him. The riders dismounted, boots striking the earth like war drums. They did not bother with courtesy. Their fists pounded on the door, their voices rang through the night. "Open up, Whitmore!" One barked. "You've shamed us all!" shouted another. "You'll answer for it tonight." The master bellowed back through the door, cursing them, daring them to enter. His hands shook, but he raised his pistol high, pride driving him where reason had long abandoned him. The door splintered beneath a boot. The riders stormed in. The cook moved aside, her face calm even as the storm erupted around her. The master fired first, wild, drunken shots that shattered portraits and sent wood splintering from the walls. The riders returned fire, and the great hall filled with smoke and chaos. The enslaved gathered outside, drawn by the thunder of gunfire. Some clutched each other, others whispered prayers, but none moved to intervene. This was not their battle. This was the collapse of the house that had chained them, and they would not lift a hand to save it. Inside, the fight raged. The master, desperate, overturned a table, reloaded with shaking hands, and shouted curses that echoed through the smoke. But pride could not shield him. A shot tore through his shoulder, another through his leg. He fell to the floor, blood spreading across the polished wood. Still he laughed, a wild, broken sound. "You think you've beaten me," he spat, blood flecking his lips. "I've bound myself to her, and that shame will live with you all!" He turned his gaze toward the cook, as though her silence mocked him in his final hour. One of the riders stepped forward, rifle aimed steady. "You brought this on yourself, Whitmore," he said coldly. The final shot rang out, and the master's laughter died with him. The house fell silent, save for the hiss of smoke and the crackle of fire from the hearth. The riders lowered their guns, breathing hard. They turned to the cook, their faces uneasy. Though they had come to kill the man, they could not erase the truth he had left behind, the woman he had mocked, married, and tied to their shame. "You'll say nothing of this," one warned her, his voice sharp. "The story ends tonight." She met his gaze without fear. She had no need to speak. Her silence carried more weight than any words could. The riders left as quickly as they had come, dragging the master's body with them into the dark. The enslaved watched from the shadows, their eyes wide, their hearts pounding. When the sound of hooves faded, a deep quiet settled over the plantation. The cook remained by the hearth, her face lit by firelight. She did not weep. She did not smile. She simply stood, her shoulders steady, as though she had always known this would be the end. In the quarters, whispers spread like sparks. Some said the master's death was the work of God, others that it was the cook's silent strength that had cursed him. Whatever the truth, one thing was certain: the plantation had changed forever. The man who had chained them with arrogance and cruelty was gone. The walls of the great house still stood, but its power had collapsed with the body carried out into the night. For the first time in years, the enslaved breathed without his shadow pressing down. But freedom was not yet theirs. The land still belonged to others, the system still held strong. Yet in their hearts, a seed had been planted, a belief that even the proudest masters could fall, that pride and cruelty could be undone. And in the cook's silence, they found hope. She had endured unbroken, and in the end it was her presence that had marked his destruction. The reckoning had come, the storm had passed. And though the chains remained, the night felt different, lighter, fragile, and full of dangerous possibilities. When dawn broke over the plantation, The air was still heavy with the echoes of the night before. The gunfire, the shouts, the final shot that ended the master's reign, each lingered in the memory of those who had lived through it. The enslaved rose from their cabins cautiously, as though afraid the violence might still hang in the air. They gathered in clusters, whispering to one another, their voices hushed but urgent. For the first time in years, the great house did not command their fear. Its windows were dark, its master gone, its halls echoing with emptiness. The body had been carried off by the riders who came in the night. No one knew where they took him. Some said he was buried in secret on his family's land. Others believed they had dumped him in the river, letting the current wash away the shame he had brought upon them. The truth mattered little. What mattered was that he was gone, and with him, the weight of his cruelty. The plantation did not collapse in an instant. Overseers still came to shout orders, and work in the fields continued, though the rhythm was broken. The cook, his so-called wife, remained in the house, not by choice, but because those who replaced him insisted she continue her duties. Yet something had changed. She was no longer paraded before guests, no longer mocked or flaunted as a symbol of pride. To the overseers, she was simply another worker. To the enslaved, she was something more. They looked at her with quiet reverence. She had endured what no one else could have imagined, bound by a marriage born of arrogance and cruelty, and yet she had not broken. She had stood through humiliation, through rage, through years of being used as the living reminder of a bet. And when the master's end came, she had watched in silence, unflinching. To the others, that silence was not weakness. It was strength. It was survival. In the quarters, stories began to grow around her. Children whispered that she carried a curse, that her calm had drawn death to the master's door. Others said she had been chosen by God to endure, to prove that even the strongest chains could not bind the spirit. Whether myth or truth, the enslaved clung to those stories, for they gave them hope in a world that offered so little. Meanwhile, the plantation's new caretakers, distant relatives of the master, moved quickly to restore order. They avoided speaking of his death, pretending instead that he had simply taken ill or traveled away. To them, the scandal was something to be buried, erased, forgotten. They did not understand that for those who had lived it, it could never be erased. The land itself seemed to carry the memory. The fields, once fertile, grew stubborn. Crops withered under the summer sun, rain refused to fall when it was needed most. Workers moved slowly, as though weighed down by something unseen. Overseers blamed laziness, but the enslaved knew better. They whispered that the soil had turned against the house, that the pride of its master had poisoned it. His ghost, some said, still lingered, prowling the halls at night, shouting curses no one could understand. The cook moved through it all with the same quiet presence. She tended fires, prepared meals, kept the house running, but her silence carried more weight than ever. She spoke little, yet when her eyes met another's, it was as though she passed a message without words. We endure. We outlast. There were moments when she thought of escape. She had heard whispers of the Underground Railroad, of safe houses that stretched northward like stepping stones to freedom. Others spoke of uprisings, of breaking chains by fire and blade. But she had also seen too much blood, too much pain. She knew the cost of rash defiance. Survival, she believed, was its own form of resistance. Still, in her heart, she carried something stronger than fear. The memory of that night, the master sprawled in his own blood, his laughter silenced, was a reminder that even the mightiest could fall. That belief, quiet though it was, spread through the quarters like a hidden flame. The enslaved worked under the overseer's eyes, but in their hearts, they felt something different, the knowledge that power was not eternal. That pride could be shattered. Years later, long after the fields had changed hands again and the house stood half empty, the story lived on. Children born into bondage grew up hearing it whispered by firesides. She married him, their elders said, but she never bent to him. And in the end, he was the one broken. For them, it was more than a tale of cruelty. It was proof that even in silence, resistance could exist. The outside world eventually forgot the master. His name faded from records, his scandal buried beneath layers of polite lies. But within the memory of the enslaved, his story endured, not as he would have wanted, not as a man of power, but as a warning of what pride and cruelty could do. As for the cook, her name too was lost to time. Yet her presence lingered in the land, in the whispers, in the quiet dignity passed down through generations. She was no longer a victim of a drunken bet. She was the heart of a story that refused to die. In the end, the plantation became a ruin. The fields lay fallow. The house crumbled, and the family line dwindled. But those who had once been enslaved carried the memory with them, whether they stayed or sought new lives after emancipation. They carried the lesson of endurance, of silence that spoke louder than any words. The master had believed his marriage would prove his dominance, that it would bind his world tighter. Instead, it had unraveled him, left his legacy in ashes, and the woman he had tried to use as a symbol of his power became the symbol of his destruction. The sun set over the broken estate, casting long shadows across the land. The air was quiet but not empty. It carried the echoes of chains, of gunfire, of laughter that had turned to curses. It carried the memory of a woman who had endured, and through endurance, had outlasted them all. The story did not end with freedom, nor with revenge, but with survival. And in survival lay a power greater than pride. By the late 1860s, the plantation was little more than a shadow of itself. The Civil War had swept across the South, tearing down the structures of power that once seemed unshakable. Fields that had once flourished with cotton now lay overgrown with weeds. The grand house, once a monument to arrogance, stood in decay, its shutters broken, its roof sagging, its halls hollow. To passers-by it looked like any other southern ruin, one of countless estates swallowed by time. But to those who lived nearby, it carried a story too heavy to forget. The neighbors who had once silenced the scandal never spoke of it again. They told their children that the Whitmore family line had ended in shame, but gave no details. They avoided the subject at gatherings, lowered their voices whenever outsiders asked. But silence is a poor grave for truth. The story refused to stay buried. Among the former enslaved, the tale lived on vividly. They told it in whispers by firelight, passing it from parent to child. Some told it as a warning of the dangers of pride, others as a lesson in endurance. But all agreed on one point: the cook, the woman bound by a bet, had outlasted them all. To some she became almost mythical, a figure of quiet power whose silence had broken the master more thoroughly than any rebellion could. Travelers began to hear the rumors. A peddler passing through town might hear a whispered tale of the man who married his slave for a wager. A Union soldier returning home might share a campfire story of a house cursed by pride. Soon the plantation gained a reputation that reached beyond Virginia. To some it was a scandal, to others a ghost story. Local folk swore the place was haunted. They said on summer nights, when the cicadas screamed in the trees, you could hear laughter echoing from the empty halls. A broken, mocking laugh that belonged to no living soul. Others claimed to see a figure in the window, a woman standing silently, her face hidden by shadow, watching the fields. Children dared each other to creep near the house, to knock on its door to prove their courage. Few stayed long, for the silence inside seemed heavy, suffocating, alive. The new owners, distant relatives who had inherited the land, tried to erase the past. They painted over cracked walls, cut new rows into the soil, hired workers to repair the gates. But no matter how much they scrubbed, the story clung to the place like a stain. Workers muttered of bad luck. Crops failed, tools broke, accidents seemed to stalk the fields. Some whispered that the master's ghost cursed the land, furious at those who had killed him. Others said it was not the master, but the cook. Her silent endurance turned to a restless spirit, refusing to let the world forget what had been done. In nearby towns, the story took on new forms. Preachers used it in sermons, warning their congregations of the wages of sin and pride. Storytellers wove it into fireside tales, their voices hushed as they spoke of the cursed marriage that destroyed a family. Abolitionist writers in the North resurrected it as proof of slavery's corruption, while Southern gentlemen dismissed it as lies spun by enemies. Yet even in denial, they could not erase it. The tale endured because it had roots too deep, buried in the soil of lived memory. For those who had lived it, the men and women once enslaved on the plantation, it was more than a story. It was a scar. Many had fled during the war, scattering to freedom in the North or across new towns built by freedmen. Yet when they spoke of their past, the story of the master and his cook returned again and again. It was not just about cruelty, nor just about survival. It was about the truth that even the most powerful could fall, that endurance itself was a weapon, and that silence could echo louder than screams. Years later, travelers recorded fragments of the story. One abolitionist wrote of meeting an old woman who claimed to have known the cook personally. She never raised her voice, the woman said, but her eyes spoke for her. And in the end, it was his eyes that went dark, not hers. Another traveler told of a freedman who refused to set foot near the ruins. "That place is cursed," he whispered. "Blood in the wood, shame in the walls." The Whitmore name, once spoken with pride among the planter class, became an afterthought. Families who had once toasted his harvest now avoided any mention of him. But the silence was never complete. Whispers persisted, around campfires, in churchyards, at market stalls. No one wanted to claim the story, yet no one could entirely forget it. By the turn of the century, the plantation was abandoned. Ivy crept up its walls, trees swallowed the fields, and animals nested in its decaying rooms. But children still told the tale in secret. They dared each other to wander near the ruins, to call out the name of the master or the cook, to see what would answer. Some swore they heard footsteps in the empty halls, others that they saw shadows move when no one stood there. Whether real or imagined, the place remained alive in their minds. The true ending of the cook's life was never recorded. Some said she lived quietly until old age, working in silence until the day her body gave out. Others claim she disappeared one night, vanishing into the woods, perhaps following whispers of freedom even when freedom had finally been written into law. Still others insisted she was buried near the house, her spirit bound to the place that had defined her. No matter the truth, her silence became eternal. And so, the story remained, a scandal, a warning, a haunting. To some, it was the tale of a master destroyed by pride. To others, it was the tale of a woman whose silence carried more strength than any man's fury. But to all, it was a reminder that the past never stays buried. The ruins whispered, the land remembered, and the truth endured, waiting for each new ear to hear it. The plantation had fallen, the man was gone, but the story lived, drifting like smoke through generations, clinging to the soil of Virginia like a shadow that could never be erased. By the dawn of the 20th century, the South had reshaped itself. Railroads carved new lines across the land, factories grew in place of fields, and towns that had once thrived on cotton began to reinvent themselves. Yet for all the progress, some scars never healed. The Whitmore plantation stood as one such scar, a ruin no one could cleanse, a reminder of a past too dark to ignore. The once grand house had collapsed inward, its roof caved, its wooden beams rotted to splinters. Grass and ivy covered the stone steps, the gates rusted into jagged shadows. From the road, it looked like nothing more than an abandoned relic, but for the people who lived nearby, it was still alive. They called it cursed, haunted, poisoned by the sins of its master. No family stayed long when they tried to settle on the land. Crops withered, storms tore down barns, livestock sickened without reason. By then, the legend was not just of a scandal, but of a curse. The story of the plantation owner and his cook had become folklore. It spread through whispers and retellings, reshaped with each telling. To some, it was a moral tale of arrogance punished by divine justice. To others, it was a southern ghost story filled with specters and restless spirits. And to the descendants of those who had once labored on the land, it was truth, a history their grandparents had lived through, a wound that could not be erased. Some said that on moonlit nights, the cook could be seen walking the fields, her figure heavy but unbowed, her shadow stretching longer than any living person's. Others claimed they heard her humming in the kitchens, a tune that grew louder when silence fell. Still others swore they saw the master himself, pacing through the ruins, his laughter echoing and breaking into a scream. No matter the version, the land itself seemed to whisper their names. In time, the story reached scholars and writers who dug into local archives, searching for proof. They found fragments, mentions in diaries, records of marriage unusual for its time, clippings of gossip in yellowed newspapers. But nothing complete, nothing whole. The story seemed determined to remain half in shadow, as though even history itself conspired to keep it shrouded. Yet every fragment pointed to one truth, that something unthinkable had happened here, and that it had destroyed not only a man but a way of life. By 1910, the plantation ruins had become a place of pilgrimage for curious travelers. Writers came seeking inspiration, ghost hunters came seeking thrills, and locals came only reluctantly, muttering prayers as they passed. For them, it was not entertainment but inheritance, a weight handed down through generations. Some wanted to forget, but forgetting is never simple. The land itself would not allow it. In a small church not far from the ruins, descendants of the enslaved told the story differently. They did not frame it as a ghost tale but as an act of quiet triumph. "She endured," one elder said. "They bet against her, mocked her, chained her with vows, but she endured. And in the end, he was the one broken. That is her victory." To them, she was no ghost but a symbol of resilience, a reminder that silence could be louder than cruelty, that survival itself was a form of resistance. The cook's true name was long forgotten, buried under years of neglect and silence. But her story endured, more powerful than a name. In whispers, she became the woman who would not break, a figure larger than life, a legend forged not by choice but by the weight of history. The master, on the other hand, was remembered only in shame. His descendants avoided the subject, changing their names, moving away, trying to sever the bloodline from the curse of memory. But the stain could not be erased. His arrogance, his cruelty, his drunken wager, they had become part of the land's very identity. He was not remembered as a man, but as a warning, a shadow cast across generations. As decades passed, the plantation faded further into ruin. Yet the story only grew stronger. In books, in whispered stories, in the tales of travelers, the scandal lived on. It crossed state lines, traveled into new towns, became part of the South's dark folklore. And with each retelling, the cook stood taller, her silence more commanding, her endurance more powerful. By the 1930s, the ruins were little more than rubble, stones swallowed by earth, wood rotted into dust. Yet even then, people avoided the land. Farmers refused to plow near it. Children ran past it with wide eyes, and preachers used it as a lesson in pride, cruelty, and the inescapable reach of justice. The story had outlived the land itself, becoming immortal in memory. The irony was clear to all who reflected on it. The master, who had lived to display his power, his wealth, his arrogance, had been forgotten in shame. The cook, who had been treated as less than human, had become legend. Her silence had spoken across decades, while his voice had crumbled into nothing but whispers of ridicule. In the end, it was not the master's bet that shocked the South, nor even his downfall. It was her survival. Against cruelty, against humiliation, against the weight of bondage and scorn, she endured. And endurance, in its quiet way, outlasted them all. So the ruins stood empty yet alive. Echoes carried through the broken halls, whispers clung to the fields, shadows moved in the night. Travelers spoke of it as cursed, haunted, or holy, depending on what they chose to see. But one truth remained clear: the story of the cook and the master had not died. It lived in the soil, in the air, in the very bones of Virginia. And it will live still, as long as there are ears to hear the whispers and hearts willing to remember.